guys. Today we're going to talk about natural selection and also some different types of selection, just continuing our evolution discussion from last time. So, first of all, we're talking about natural selection because natural selection is sort of what pushes evolution to happen. A lot of times people lump together natural selection and evolution as the same thing, but actually, it's more true that natural selection causes evolution. Natural selection just means that certain species or certain individuals survive better because they are more fit for their environment. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. Before we write out a definition of natural selection, I wanted to just mention Charles Darwin, who probably you've heard of before, but he is considered to be the father of evolution. So, kind of like Gregor Mendel was the father of genetics, Charles Darwin is the father of evolution. He's the first person who figured out that natural selection works the way that it works. And he studied finches, which are birds. So, if you ever hear about them, they're talking about Charles Darwin. All right, so now on to natural selection. Natural selection is the idea that individuals in a population who have higher fitness, yeah, have higher fitness for their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. And on the flip side, individuals who are not fit for their environment or they have something that makes them less likely to survive will not survive as often and will not reproduce, which means their genes will not get passed on. And over time, those genes will become less and less common. The individuals who have high fitness will get to pass on their genes, and so their genes will become more and more common over time. Before we go any further, I just want to define the word fitness, which is a little bit different than the like go work out concept of fitness. So basically, what it means is that these individuals have a characteristic. Well, actually, I'm just going to define like fitness. It's a general thing. So, fitness is how well suited you are for your environment, which means like if you're a brown mouse and you live in the dirt, then you are probably pretty high in terms of your fitness because you blend in. If you're a red cardinal and you live in a green tree, you probably are pretty low in terms of your fitness. But we're going to talk about why there are still red cardinals, even though they have pretty low fitness. But your fitness is just how well suited you are for your environment. If you have high fitness, you're more likely to survive and pass on your genes. If you have low fitness, you're less likely to survive and pass on your. All right. So for evolution or natural selection to occur, so for natural selection to happen, which will drive evolution to happen, there has to be four things that are true. They are variation, selection, inheritance, and time. They spell visit without the first I, which is a nice little way to remember. So, first of all, before we go any further, I just want to mention that natural selection and evolution acts on populations. It doesn't act on individuals. So, in your lifetime, you as one person will not evolve in the scientific term of what evolve means. One bird does not evolve. An entire population of birds can evolve, but not just one of them. Okay, so that said, four things we need for natural selection to happen. The first one is variation. Variation means differences between individuals within a population. So that means like there are some brown mice and there are some white mice. There are some tall trees and there are some short trees. Like there is differences between the individuals in the population. If there are no differences, then one individual has no higher fitness than the other. So there will be no natural selection in that case. All right, selection means that one trait has higher fitness than another in that environment. This is also sometimes called selective pressure. Which means there has to be some force that's causing one trait to be better than the other. So, for example, if there's a population of mice and some are white and some are brown and they live in the snow, but there's nothing there that eats them, then one is no better than the other. There's no reason that having brown fur is negative. But now, if the mice live in the snow and there's a bunch of hawks that also live in the snow, then now there's a selective pressure there because the hawks will see the brown mice first, so that less brown mice will reproduce. And over time, there will be more white mice because they were able to blend in. That's what selective pressure means. A lot of times, selective pressure is a predator that's eating them. It could be a food source, or it could be something else entirely, but it's some reason that one trait is better than the other. For example, if a bunch of turtles live on an island and there's only really tall trees, then only the turtles that can stretch their necks out of their shell will be able to eat. That would be a selective pressure. There's not enough food for all of them. Okay, so now the next thing that's important is that the trait has to be heritable, which is what inheritance. It means that this only works when the trait is genetic. So I'm going to make a note here that says trait must be genetic or heritable, which means the organisms must be able to pass the trait on to their offspring. So, for example, like a trait that is not heritable is like all of the things that you've learned in your life. If you're really smart and you've like worked really hard to learn a lot of things, when you have children, that's not a genetic trait. So natural selection won't work on that because it's not a trait that's heritable. Same thing, like if you work out a ton and you like get super strong and you're a really good athlete, you don't pass that on to your children. So those are things that are not um, affected by natural selection. It has to be things that could be passed on that are genetic in order for natural selection to work on them. And then finally, the last thing that's really important is you just have to have a really long time, like generations and generations and generations. Like I said before, one individual doesn't evolve in their lifetime. It takes a whole generation for you to see any changes from natural selection actually show up. And a lot of times it takes even more than one generation, it takes many. So that's why when we're talking about evolution in this unit, we're looking at millions of years of time before you see like a new species evolve because it just takes forever. In some species that reproduce faster, it takes less time. So in like bacteria, evolution can happen really fast, but in like organisms that reproduce slowly, like mammals, evolution takes a long time to show up. So I'm going to say here that time means evolution takes generations I'm going to make a note that says there is no evolution in one lifetime. There can be selection, there can be selective pressure in one lifetime, but there will not be evolution. Okay, this I left on here for you, that all of this stuff that's happening, the variation, is coming from a mutation. Mutations are totally random. So sometimes they're helpful and they get passed on. For example, like if you are a mouse and you get a mutation that makes you albino and you live in the Arctic, that's a beneficial mutation because now you can blend in, you'll live longer. Sometimes mutations are harmful and those individuals are selected against. And then, actually, most often, sometimes mutations have totally no effect at all, which means the organism has a mutation, but they're completely unaffected by it. So, just a note here that this is random. Everything that's happened so far is like just due to random mutations that were beneficial to those organisms building up over time, to eventually lead to the species that we have now. And then I think I'm just going to go back up here really quick and make a note on this about the population and say one individual cannot evolve. Where's that? So only the group can. That's really important. So one thing does not evolve, the group evolves as a whole. Okay, let's come down here. All right, so like I said when I was talking about time, typically natural selection is too slow to actually see any changes occur, um, because it just takes so long. It takes generations and generations. But there are a couple examples where humans have actually sped up the process of natural selection without really meaning to. In both of these examples, it's not really good that we sped up natural selection because we selected for the ones that are the worst for us. And we're going to talk about how variation, selection, inheritance, and time are visible in these two examples. All right, so example number one, you have a farmer. The farmer sprays his crop field or her crop field with a pesticide in order to kill insects that would have eaten the crops. That's a totally normal thing, happens all the time. But when the farmer sprays the crops, it immediately kills off all of the insects who did not have resistance. Some of the insects naturally had a mutation that caused them to be resistant to the pesticide. Resistant means able to survive it. So now, what the farmer has done without knowing it is that they have wiped out all of the variation in the population. So only the insects that reproduce, they're all the resistant ones, which means the next year when the farmer sprays the same pesticide, it's not going to work because the next generation of insects is entirely resistant to that pesticide because the farmer, without meaning to, killed off all the ones that were not resistant. So only the bugs with the mutation were able to actually pass on their traits. Okay, so now try to figure out where is the variation in this example? Where is the selection or the selective pressure? How is this showing inheritance? And how is it showing generations of time? Pause and try to figure it out. All right, let's solve it. So let's see if you got it right. So for variation, the variation that we see here is that some bugs have resistance. Some don't. That is the difference in the population that we really care about. The selective pressure is the pesticide that kills off all the ones who don't have resistance. So the selection is the pesticide spray. This shows inheritance because the mutation is genetic. So mutation is genetic. And can be passed on. And finally, it shows a generation of time because a year passes, and that's enough time for the next generation of bugs to have hatched. This is 1 year later equals new generation of bugs. Okay, now let's look at one more example that actually can happen in your body. All right, so let's say that you get sick, you have a bacterial infection. Let's say it's strep throat. When you go to the doctor is going to give you an antibiotic. The purpose of an antibiotic is to kill bacteria. That's the only thing that an antibiotic will kill. So, what happens is the antibiotic starts working in your body. It kills off all the bacteria except for any bacteria that naturally had a random mutation that caused them to be resistant to that specific antibiotic. Then, because most of the bacteria die, you are feeling great. So you stop taking your antibiotic a little early because you're like, I'm better. I'm all good. I don't have to take all of these antibiotic pills. When that happens, there are some good bacteria that probably are left behind. They didn't get killed off all the way. Um, and so the resistant bacteria actually can and do pass a resistance plasmid, which maybe you remember plasmids from our biotech unit, but they're little circles of DNA that have resistance to the antibiotic. So those bacteria pass their resistance to the bacteria that are making you sick. And all of a sudden, the bacteria start to replicate. You take the rest of your antibiotics because you're like, I feel sick again and I don't understand. But now your antibiotic isn't going to work because you killed off all of the bacteria that were not resistant to that. So the only ones that are left in your body are resistant to the antibiotic. The one you take isn't going to kill them off. That means you're going to have to go back to the doctor. You're going to have to get a stronger antibiotic, and you're going to take it for the entire time because then you're not going to run into this problem again. Stronger antibiotics usually will have like more side effects, like they'll make your stomach hurt, or they're just not super great. They don't make you feel really great. So you want to try to take the weakest antibiotic possible. So now let's see if you can find the examples of variation, selection, inheritance, and time in this example. Pause and see if you can figure it out. All right, let's see if you got it right. So for this one, the variation is in the bacteria. The variation is that some bacteria are naturally resistant. Some are not. So that's the differences between the bacteria. The selective pressure this time is the antibiotic. It's coming in, it's killing off all of the ones that it can kill off, all of the ones that don't have the mutation. So the selective pressure is antibiotic. The inheritance factor here is the plasmid. So I'm going to say that plasmids are DNA that can be passed so they can be inherited. And then finally, time is the bacteria replicating. That means that it's a new generation. For bacteria, this is able to happen really, really fast because they reproduce, some of them every 20 minutes, new copy. So it's really easy for them to make you feel really sick really fast because they duplicate so quickly. Okay, so those are two examples of natural selection in action in real life. There are tons and tons of other examples. We're going to do a lab that shows an example, or you have done it, depending on whether you're green or gold. And now I want to tell you about a few types of selection. So come down to your next page. All right. So there are four types of natural selection that I'm going to tell you about: directional, stabilizing, disruptive, and sexual. All of these are types of natural selection in action, but it's just natural selection causing specific changes in one direction. Alrighty, so we're going to start with directional selection. And for each of these, you're going to see a graph that shows a population. It's of mice for most of them. On the y-axis is the number of mice, and on the x-axis is the color. And there's also a little description that tells you where the mice live. So for this example, we start out, we have some really light mice and some really dark mice, and most of the mice are in between. And we know that because the peak of the graph, which is equal to a lot, is in the middle. So most mice are medium brown, tan. But these mice live in a forest, and the forest floor is dark brown. So that means probably the dark mice are going to be able to survive a little better because they're going to be able to camouflage, they're going to be able to blend in. So over time, what you will see is the population starting to shift. And what that will look like is the peak of the graph moving more towards the dark. So we're going to start to have a lot of mice that are here in the dark section. And we're going to have less mice that are medium and light. And we're going to have even more mice that are even darker than before. We're going to keep this curve shape. So what's happened is the peak of the graph has shifted this way in one specific direction. And I'm going to make a note here that this is after many generations. So what this means is that one extreme phenotype, I'll say, has higher fitness than the other. So over time, the population shifts toward that trait. So I just want to make a note here that this is not because the mice are deciding to do this. They're not like, oh, it will be better if we were darker, so we're going to become darker. It's happening because the light mice are not surviving long enough to pass on their genes. They're getting killed off. So only the mice that are dark in color are getting to reproduce and getting to pass on their genes. And that's what's causing this shift, is that the light ones are dying before they can reproduce. So more dark ones are reproducing, which means more offspring are dark. That's why this directional shift is happening. Okay, let's talk about the next one. Okay, so the next example is stabilizing selection. This example is a pretty cool example that actually happens in humans. In stabilizing selection, the case is that the average or the middle, say the average or the middle has higher fitness than either extreme phenotype. So what that means is over time, the population is going to stabilize. It's going to become even more average. An example of this that happens in humans is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a disorder that causes red blood cells to become sickle shaped instead of being round. And if you have sickle cell anemia, you have a disorder that is really painful. We watched that video about it during biotech about the girl who got gene therapy to help treat her. But it's a really painful disorder. Those people are two small h's. So they're these people here. If someone has sickle cell, because of their blood cell shape, they actually cannot get malaria. Malaria is an infectious disease that is transmitted by mosquitoes. So people who have sickle cell have a disorder, but they also can't get malaria. People who have normal blood, they have two big H's. They don't have a disorder, so they have normal blood. And they also can get malaria because their blood cells are the right shape for the parasite that is malaria to attach to it. Malaria is pretty deadly. It's a really just not great disease to contract. It's a pathogenic disease. But these people who are in the middle, they're heterozygote and they have normal blood and they can't get malaria. So these people, we say that they have the heterozygote advantage because they're normal in terms of their blood. They don't have the painful sickle cell disorder, but they have enough blood cells that are sickle shaped that they can't get malaria. So that's the best case scenario for them. So over time, what we should see is that this trait becomes even more common. The peak gets even higher because that is the most advantageous trait to have. It's the highest fitness. I'm going to label this one and say that this is after many generations. And you would think that this is the case because the people who are the two big H's could die from malaria before they're able to reproduce. The people who have two small H's could die from sickle cell before they're able to reproduce. But here's the thing is you're never going to completely get rid of big H people or small h people because the person who is the advantage is heterozygous. So that means that they can produce people, children, who have two small h's or two big H's. So neither of those traits are going to die out all the way, but they're just going to become a lot less common. The other thing that's true is that this is only the case in places where malaria is common. Malaria is carried by mosquitoes, and mosquitoes live in tropical areas. So if the people don't live in a tropical area, then there is no advantage to being a heterozygote. So this wouldn't be the case. But in tropical areas, this is the case that it's an advantageous to be heterozygous, and that is stabilizing selection. Okay, let's look at number 3. Number 3 is disruptive selection. So what this means is that both extremes are more advantageous than the average. Okay, so in this situation, we have our same curve that we started with at the beginning. Now we have our mice that live in a desert. There's light sand and there's dark rocks. So that means that our mice who are tan, they're in the middle, they don't blend into the light sand and they don't blend into the dark rocks. So over time, what you're going to start to get is you're going to get, oops, more light colored mice, very few tan colored mice, and more dark colored mice. And these mice are going to live mostly at the rocks. And these mice are going to live mostly in the sand. And again, this is after many generations. And this one could eventually lead to a new species. Because over time, you could start to get the mice that live at the rocks never leaving the rocks because they'll get eaten in the sand. And the mice that live in the sand never leaving the sand because they'll get eaten anywhere else. And so the populations will start to become more and more different because they only mate within their own population. And eventually, they'll become so different that if you put them back together, they wouldn't be able to mate anymore because they would have become so different after many, many, many generations. And that is when you have a new species. So make a note over here that says speciation. Put this here equals forming a new species. And this occurs when two individuals cannot mate or produce fertile offspring. And we'll talk more about that another time. But basically, that's what a species is. A species is a group that can only mate within their own species and only produce fertile offspring within their own species. Okay, last thing is sexual selection. And this one's super interesting. So sexual selection happens when usually males have specific traits that make them more attractive to females. And so those males are more likely to get mates and their traits get passed on more often. This eventually can lead to something called sexual dimorphism in animals, which is what happens when the males look really, really different from the females. So I'm going to make that note here that this is, gosh, I'm struggling. Males look very different from females. And this is the case with cardinals because for some reason, the red color of male cardinals is more attractive to females than brown color. So over time, what has happened is that only the red male cardinals were getting mates. After so many generations, there weren't any brown male cardinals left. They're all red. So even though a red cardinal in a green tree is more likely to get eaten than a brown bird, the males are red because the females like it better. So that is sexual selection and sexual dimorphism. It's also true in peacocks, birds of paradise. There are tons of birds that are like this. Like the male peacocks are the ones with the like beautiful feathers. Female peacocks are like regular looking brown birds. It's really common in birds, but there are a few other species that have it too, which is super interesting. So there you go. That's sexual dimorphism and sexual selection. Again, all of these are types of natural selection. They're just specific examples of the population shifting in one specific way. Okay, great job, guys. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon. Bye.